the more deeply we look into how we produce meaning from the world, the more mysterious and fascinating the subject itself becomes. Our ability to have a complex language, therefore self-reflective, subjective thoughts, is what separates us from the animal kingdom. We can therefore deduce that if the crop circles are being made by a more than human intelligence, that they must be meant and directed at us, because we're the only species on the planet that is capable of deciphering symbols into communicable language. Symbol making is a practice developed by humans not too long ago in our history to facilitate the transmission and receiving of meaning. But for the most part, the crop circles are not conventionally recognizable symbols, like the known alphabet or skull and crossbones to represent danger, etc. But if we assume that they are some form of communication, which I think we all think that they are, then we are forced to try and decipher what they might mean, either individually as symbols or as some kind of ongoing campaign which forms some form of narrative. This is a picture of me at 3:40 a.m. standing in front of East Field on the 7th of July 2007. We sat up, there was 3 of us who did a night watch that night, and that crop circle wasn't there when it went dark, and it was there when we looked through the camera lens at 3:40 a.m. It was 1,033 feet long, 500 feet wide, and consisted of 150 circles. This is it. There are 2 elements to this event for me in my life. I'd already been researching crop circles for 10 years, and I'd kind of kept under the radar until that point. I didn't really want to get involved with too many things. I wanted to try and approach the subject, and I had a teacher at the beginning, a peyote teacher, who brought me to the crop circles initially, and he gave me some advice about just, spending time and taking time to research these things for myself in my own way. And so for 10 years, every summer I would drive down and stay here and do just that. And then on the 10th anniversary of my studies, I decided to do a night watch with my girlfriend at the time, and we met up with a cameraman who was there, and he was filming the field, hoping to catch UFOs. The whole field was recorded from 11 p.m. until the time that we found the crop circle. You can go on YouTube and watch the footage. There was a flash of white light at about 3:20 in the morning, and then 20 minutes later, when we looked through the lens of the camera, we still couldn't see. It was complete darkness with our eyes, but when we looked through the camera, that was in front of us. So we know that that appeared in under 300 minutes. And there are 2 elements to this story for me. There's my personal story, what does it mean to me and so on, and the stories of the things that happened that night, as well as my sort of testimonial that I gave out at the time. We did press interviews and said, look, we went up the hill and that happened. I don't know what it is, there it is. And then there's the question of, what does this symbol itself mean? What is it? Because I was there, I get to ask, as do the other 2, if there was any personal meaning for us. Why was I there? Am I being cosmically spoken to? So it raises those questions. And Wynne and Paula were there as well, so they must have the same thing. Was the date 777 significant to the meaning? The concept of numbers played such a significant role in the crop circles that it'd certainly be reasonable to think so. The thing is, though, once you start to investigate the significance of these numbers, you're faced with all sorts of potential meanings. For example, the number 7 is considered the perfect number in the Hebrew tradition. Christian denominations consider 7 to be the holy number, because Genesis says that God rested on the 7th day and man was created on the 6th day. Therefore, 777 is thought to be the antithesis of 666. If you believe the press last year, I'm the antithesis of someone called Truth Seeker 666, but because God rested on according to the American publication, the Orthodox Study Bible, 777 represents threefold perfection of the Trinity, whatever that means. The Watcher community uses it as a reference to the 7 angels and the 7 trumpets and the 7 bowls from the book of Revelation. In other traditions and teachings, we've got 7 chakras. That's it, 7 chakras. This is what happens quite a lot when you start to try and find out what does this symbol mean. If you look at what other people say, or you look for potential meanings yourself, you're faced with so many that in the end you just go, well, it could be one of them, it could be all of them, I don't know. One of the personal stories that happened to me that night is that just before Paula and I were staying in a caravan, and just before we left the caravan that night, there was a carrier bag that we use as a kind of trash bag for our stuff in the caravan, and it had the Welsh dragon on the side of it because I was living in Cardiff at the time. And we had a conversation about dragons, how they appear so much in mythology, why they're on the Welsh flag, and we just, went on chatting about dragons for about half an hour. Then we set off to do this night watch. And when Wynne looked through the camera at 3:40, when he first caught a glimpse of it, and he hadn't been privy to that conversation with us, his first words were, "It's a dragon." So we were like, where do you take that? Most people, though, decided to call it the Om symbol. They said it represented, if you turn it the other way, although that top kind of wiggly bit there should be sort of more around there, some people have said that in earlier days, it was actually slightly different. So it's supposed to be the universal vibration, according to what lots of people thought they'd name it. I mentioned earlier that if we believe in if they are made by a more than human intelligence, then this experience made one important point for me. I've already made the point that numbers feature quite heavily in crop circles. Well, I want you to consider these numbers for a second. There were 5 hours of darkness that night, 300 minutes. And everybody agrees that that crop circle appeared during that window. Now, there are 150 circles. If you count all the little ones up down the side, there are around about 150 circles. So that means 150 circles divided by 300 minutes is that one of those had to appear and be made every 2 minutes. I have a problem with that being done by people who we didn't see, we didn't hear, and they didn't have any torches in front of us, and it didn't get picked up by the cameras. Just look at this. This is Paula and I entering at 4:36 in the morning when it got light. You see a little bit of a victory wave from me there. And we walk in. Yeah, you can see, look, the two of us there. Then we walk to the very end there, and when it zooms out, I have a problem that people made that in front of me in under 300 minutes. Now, I can understand that's my personal position because I was there and that you're hearing this second hand, but until, well, look at this one. If I look at this one, just take a look at this. This had 409 circles, and we know that this appeared in the same 300 minutes, so roughly about that in the same night. There wasn't people there sort of watching the field like me, but it was found fairly early in the morning. If I divide 409 by 300 minutes, we got one every 45 seconds. Just that alone should make us think, maybe there's something else. Hang on, I moved my note too quick. I had all my notes lovely on the screen, but it wouldn't work before we started, so I've had to print them off. My own personal position, though, is that there is a real mystery behind the crop circles. I fully appreciate that people need to arrive at this conclusion for themselves, but for me, my own personal experiences and the simple fact that I've never been able to ever see any evidence that formations such as this can be made in complete darkness under the same conditions, then I'm not going to be convinced that people can make this until I see them do it. No more shitty demonstrations for TV where they make a 60-foot formation in the daylight and then tell us that because we do this, that means by inference we do all of this. I need to see a real demonstration under the real conditions, or some other thing which will convince me. And until then, I don't believe their claims. That's my own position. I'd rather spend my time, therefore, on more interesting topics, such as what do they mean? When crop circle research is not just about trying to determine whether they're man-made, or if you want to prove the case that aliens are visiting us, then you kind of have to find a middle road. And the middle road for me is, what do they mean? What is it all about? Why do we as human beings care so much about meaning? Okay, I was at a lecture in London, several years ago, and a man said to me, sort of just before I kicked off on my lecture, he shouted out from the back, if aliens are visiting us, if there's some sort of deep message that some other intelligence is trying to give us, why don't they just use the alphabet? Why are they putting all these symbols down here that no one can understand and that lots of people can speculate about? Why don't they just write it in English, just the same way, so we can all understand it? Well, that's a pretty good point, really. I don't think if we saw alphabet letters in the fields that anybody would take it serious, but the question raised some interesting points for me. So I thought, well, you know, let's give it a go. We can broadly categorise formations into those that represent sort of number, geometric things, those that come from mystery traditions like the Kabbalah or the I Ching, you know. And then there are those like this, which seem completely abstract and mercurial, and you can just spend the rest of your life scratching your head wondering what it means. They're enticing, they want to bring you into it, but what does it mean? There have been several formations which have been encoded with zeros and ones so that we can translate it into the English language. This one was at Wilton Windmill in 2010, and it turned out to be, excuse me, an equation, a mathematical equation called Euler's equation. And it's said to be the most beautiful equation ever written, ever made, because it unites 5 different constants in mathematics. 0 is the additive entity, 1 being the multiplicative, pi geometry, e logarithms, and I is the algebra. But beauty and harmony is what it's really known for. It's this. Now the I is an imaginary number. It's the square root of -1. It has no physical counterpart in the world. It really is purely imaginal. And yet, air traffic control wouldn't work if it wasn't for this equation. It's the very fact that we can refer to something imaginal that air traffic control computers can plot where your aeroplanes are in the sky. It's a very strange thing. It's something that's imaginal, but it has a real-world application. Check it out. Oops. There have been alphabetic formations, I beg your pardon. This one appeared in 1991. It's known as the Milk Hill script. Professor Gerald Hawkins gathered a team of 12 scholars to decipher it, and several months and 18,000 common phrases and 42 languages later, they arrived at an acceptable solution, which was aponoastos. It turned out that it was actually written in an obscure form of post-Augustan Latin from the 12th century. That's how it took so long for the linguists to find out. Which meant we oppose the acts of craft and cunning. Now, some people said that the timing of this formation, and it appeared just before Doug and Dave, the 2 old geezers, came out and said, we made them all governor with boards for a laugh. So some people said, well, was this timed to sort of say, we know what you're up to, governor, kind of thing, you know? We know that you're kind of hoaxing the world, making people believe that this. Is that one possible meaning that we could think about? Is the fact that the language dates back to the Templars in the 12th century significant for the meaning? What can we infer from that? The common factor, though, is that meaning isn't being spelled out to us. It's definitely asking for our active participation. It has to put it in one form and ask us to go away and work and try and find it out. But is that all there is? Is it just that, could we just do crop circle research by looking at pictures on the internet and then never going into one and just going to the library and looking up books and trying to figure out what the meaning is? Is it just a yearly puzzle game? If we have to translate what the circle makers are writing down back into the English language, then we're back to the English alphabet again. And my questioner, who kind of hostilely said, in a hostile way, said, why aren't they all in the alphabet? So it's a fair question in that respect. If someone wants to communicate something urgent to us, why don't they use a language that we can really understand? Many people continue to see the crop circles as a sign of some sort of forthcoming consciousness shift. And that's been said, in fairness, for a very long time. Oh, we're going to enter the 5th dimension and there's going to be a consciousness shift. Some people believe that the physical manifestation of the crop circles is amping up the vibes so that the consciousness shift is going to kind of be done to us. Well, if that's the case, then we don't have to bother working out what the meanings are. We don't have to just look at some pictures and wait. and it'll all be done for us, and all our problems will go away? Or does a consciousness shift happen when you figure something out? New ideas cause consciousness shifts. They send humanity in a different direction if they're powerful enough. Somebody figures something out that somebody else didn't figure out before. So the crop circles are supposed to bring us new ideas that will change the path we're all on. My research has shown me that interacting with them on a number of levels actually teaches us something about the nature of mind and consciousness itself. And this is something I'd like to talk about today, the subject of mind and human consciousness. Modern science tells us that our consciousness is generated through neuronal activity. It's a byproduct of biology. Others take a different view. I'll leave you to explore the other views. For the purpose of this presentation, though, let's just take a quick look at definition of mind to see where we are so that we can go forward. Oxford Dictionary says it's the element of a person that enables them to be aware of the world and their experiences, to think and to feel. This guy did quite a bit of work on the subject of mind. Because of his work in mandalas, Carl Jung's been referred to quite a lot in crop circle research. But his fourfold model of mind, of our consciousness, is brilliant for getting us to understand what our experience of mind is. And his fourfold model, his quaternity of mind, as he calls it, is thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuition. Contains two of the dictionary definitions, thinking and feeling, but then we've got sensing and the more controversial intuition. If you spend a bit of time going and engaging crop circles and visiting them, you quickly find that they engage all four aspects of this. Walking into a crop circle for the first time can often get us to focus on how we are feeling. I've seen and experienced many times emotional reactions upon entering a formation, from inexplicable crying to feelings of feeling elated and high. There's a mountain of anecdotal evidence to suggest that visiting crop circles kind of amplifies your emotions, and it might not do it when you're just in there, it might last for a short while after. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest this is happening. If we stop thinking and tune in, our senses seem to become heightened. The smell of the freshly cut crop in a nearby field wafting in on the wind in my face, watching the tops of the crop quiver in the wind, the bird song and the sound of the whisper in the flow of the wind. Visiting crop circles is actually looking out at the patchwork quilt like a sensorial feast. And for city dwellers, people that don't get out into the countryside quite a lot, they're often overwhelmed by how alive and animated the landscape is that you're brought to when you visit crop circles. I'm not going to go into intuition now because we could spend all day talking about how intuition gets affected in crop circles, but there again is a lot of anecdotal evidence that crop circles play around with our intuition. People get spine-chillingly accurate intuitions about when a crop circle might appear, or they have spine-chilling coincidences that their intuition led them to, and so on. And it's a whole area of study that I think would be worthwhile, because it's a part of ourselves that we tend not to rely on and neglect. It's like the crop circles are kind of exercising that muscle that we don't use so much anymore. But as soon as we go home, sit down and reflect on what happened to us and what all those senses were, we're back to words. And if we then write them down, we're back to the alphabet again. So when we think in words, and we think about written words in terms of an alphabet. I want to take a closer look at how we began to develop symbols as a species. But before I do that, let's go back and have a look at what happened to us before we started to make symbols, when we were an oral culture. This is Avebury Stone Circle, and it's a good example of a pre-literate society, people that existed without writing and reading. And I believe there's a strong case for drawing a connection between the mystery of the stone circle monuments and the mystery of the crop circles, largely because of the fact that many of them contain the same geometric proportions. When Robin Heath will be speaking tomorrow, some of his mentors, Ewan Mackay and others, have all pointed out that the stone circles have got pi and a golden section and a lot of things that we've seen reflected in crop circles. Keith Critchlow, hang on, sorry, notes have gone a bit crazy. This is Göbekli Tepe. This is 12,000 years old. It's kind of thrown the history book out with regards to stone circles and monuments. I don't know if many of you know much about this, but it's in southern Turkey, and it was discovered in '96 by a German archaeologist, and it's built on top of a hill, stone circle, and then they filled it all in with earth and built another one on top of that, and filled it all in with earth and built another one on top of that, and there's 5 layers of stone circles. They've only just managed to scratch the surface with some of these excavations, but what they found is absolutely astounding. They consist of these sorts of pillars. Can you see the sort of outside pillars, and then these 2 pillars on the inside that seem to be like main characters, and then the outer stones they've named onlooker stones. It reminds me of this crop circle at Monument Hill back in 2013, where these seem to be like onlookers looking on towards this cube of 3D reality. It just made me think of that when I saw these stone circles. But the stones themselves inside the circle had lots of symbols on them. A lot of them were of animals, birds, and oxen appeared hugely, lots of them. Lots and lots of oxen. I don't know why they had such a significance. But lots of other animals were represented, and then lots of abstract symbols as well. Klaus Schmidt himself said that he believes that they are multivalent, that they're telling a story, that they have multiple meanings. They're like a collection of ideas. It's a very different way to communicate than the way that we communicate today with an alphabet. Please forgive me with these notes because it's been a bit of a last-minute thing. Back home here in Wales, this stone circle is sort of at 2,000 feet elevation with stunning panoramic views of the landscape. Again, Keith Critchlow, in Time Stands Still, a book written by Keith Critchlow, he says, spending time there, often shin-deep in snow, witnessing a constantly changing landscape, brings one sharply up against one's own foreignness. The weather, the nuances of the breeze, humidity, aromas, animals, birds, firmly places city dwellers back into a sensorial reality that few of us can read. One is faced with the overwhelming question, what is the intrinsic value of literacy? And does word reading reduce our ability to read the natural surroundings? Is human wizardry only to be found in libraries, universities, and modern technology? Sitting on this hill is not an intellectual effort, as one is part of an experience. The questions of existence, both of oneself and of nature as a whole, of which one is a part, become far more important than speculations as to who did what, when, and why. You can see the parallels with crop circles. This is the generally accepted model of human development. First we were savages, then we became barbarians, and then we apparently moved into civilization, which contains high culture, monumental architecture, sophisticated technology, cities, and literacy. So this is from the Greeks onwards when we apparently became civilized. Göbekli Tepe kind of throws that book out because it's 9,600 BC. It really would be difficult, I think, to have built Göbekli Tepe in southern Turkey if you were just savages running around. So we've got a real problem with the timeline of our history, with what some of these archaeological sites tell us, and then we can dive deeper into what do these symbols mean that are on their pillars, how were they communicating, and how did their world differ from us with its worldview? How could it be different? I want to focus on literacy today, though. These 3 factors are the pivotal factors in humanity's move from an oral culture to a civilization where we had literature, where we began to use abstract symbols to communicate with each other. Now, in crop circle research, metrology, the measuring of things, has been extensively covered from the outset. Contributions from the likes of John Michel, John Martineau, Michael Glickman, and so on. The understanding to be gained from their work is paramount if you want to start to get into crop circles. Reading what John Michel, Michael Glickman, John Martineau established from the metrological studies of crop circles is first step. I'd never actually heard of the golden section or the Fibonacci sequence or any of this stuff before I encountered crop circles. And the ingenious discovery by John Martineau that underlying the explicit symbol, the glyph in the field itself, I think Dan's printed a t-shirt over there with 5 dots on it, and you can see there's an implicit pentagram. That pentagram wasn't in the field, all we had was the 5 dots, but what we've discovered, what John Martineau discovered by that pentagram being implicitly inside, revealed lots and lots and lots and lots of information to us that we didn't really know before about the hidden nature of number in reality. Subsequent research has shown that flowers and material reality itself, even Venus, our nearest planet, it's like 5, 8 and 13 forms the Fibonacci sequence. They're these 3 main numbers. So we have 8 notes in an octave. There's a perfect fifth in an octave. When you're born, you have 5 teeth in each quarter of your mouth, which fall out and are replaced by 8 teeth, 5, 8 and 13. If you pick up lots and lots of flowers and you count the buds that are on the stems, you'll find that there'll be 8 buds in 5 turns, turns of the stalk. Pineapples, fir cones, all have got the Fibonacci sequence all going around them. So life, material reality, is massively beating out these 3 numbers, and no one knows why. There's been some sort of theories of optimization and so on, but no one's nailed why these 3 numbers. And John Martineau, from his research in crop circles, fed these ratios and proportions into a computer program that he wrote, and fed the solar system into it, and found that Venus, our nearest planet, if we fix the Earth, if we look at how Venus moves around us, it goes out behind the sun. Venus goes out behind the sun, comes in towards and kisses us, goes out again, comes in and kisses and goes out again, and actually creates a nice, beautiful 5-fold pentagram in the drawing it draws around us in 8 Earth years or 13 Venus years. So our nearest planet is actually massively beating out 5, 8, 13, and no one knows why. And we only found this out because of stuff that we found hidden in crop circles. This body of work shows us that the simplicity of these numbers, that the universe is more ordered than we might first think. That as a species, we uniquely have minds that can make sense of this stuff. History of agriculture can't be underestimated either. Agriculture represents a shift in human consciousness. And as it forms the canvas which crop circles are laid on, I think it's a massive part of the context of the message. Let's not forget that the patchwork quilt that we see when we laid out in front of us is not natural at all. We've actually done a great deal of damage, and we're doing a great deal of damage with over-intensification of agriculture because we're out of balance with it. We're deforesting rainforests to grow palm oil trees, and we're thinking about genetically modified crops to try and feed people and so on and so forth against organic alternatives. And these are real issues for how our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren are going to exist on this planet. So as Wiltshire is where farming began in this country, on the Salisbury Plain at Old Sarum, and this is where history goes back and tells us farming and agriculture began here, I believe that the context of a message can be taken from the surroundings. So we're starting to broaden ourselves out from just the symbol itself. Literature is the one I want to look at today, though. How did we survive without it? The Aboriginal people did for 40 or 60,000 years. They're a perfect example of a culture that existed way before the technology of writing was introduced. Without writing, people in an oral culture, our ancestors, passed down accumulated knowledge and wisdom by telling stories. We refer to these stories today as myths, fables and fairy tales. They're considered to be primitive, childlike explanations of causality or creation. But anthropologists are now beginning to realise that they're much more sophisticated than that. Without reading and writing, using an alphabet, how differently did these people consider language and their own self-aware minds back then? What was their worldview? What is the qualitative difference between a mind of someone of a pre-literate culture and our minds today? How good must their memories have been to be able to pass down accumulated knowledge without any loss of integrity? Today we think we have to read a load of books, fill our heads with information, pass a test, and it doesn't matter, we can forget about it. And studies have recently shown that 67% of what students learn as static nuggets of data, history, dates, and so on, is gone 2 weeks after they've forgotten it, they've remembered it. If we look at plant knowledge, how they retained plant knowledge, for example, this knowledge could only be preserved by being woven into stories, as I've said. But the specific characteristics of the plant are made evident through a narrated series of events and interactions. The reason for this is that stories are easily felt They're incorporated into our felt experience. In hearing or telling a story, we vicariously live it, and the travails of the characters embed themselves into our own flesh. I want you to think for a minute that the body, sensuous breathing body that I've talked about that's going out into the landscape that we live with every day, isn't a fixed, unchanging object. It's more of a kind of dynamic, unfolding form as we grow and as we breathe every day. So as such, it doesn't really fit that we're wired to appropriate static nuggets of information or data. We don't hold on to them. But give us a story with all the twists and turns and ups and downs and all the hard work's done for us. The more lively, the better. Oral memorization calls for lively and dynamic. If the story contains knowledge about a particular plant, then that entity will be cast, like all others, in animate form, capable of person-like adventures and experiences. In this manner, the character of the plant will be easily remembered, its poisonous attributes avoided, and the precise steps of its preparation will be evident from the sequence of events from the legend that they chant while they're making it. So we often think that when someone's chanting, when they're doing preparing the plants, that they're putting a spell in it, right? But they're actually remembering what to do, what bits they need to get rid of, right? How when they go out and collect it, and what bits to throw away, and so on. So it's really clever that they can do that and keep memories going for 60,000 years, pass down knowledge to each other in that way. So it's not a spell in that sense, although I am open to the fact that the invocation might do something to it, but that's another matter. These stories as well also applied to navigation. The term songlines was actually introduced by an author called Bruce Chatwin back in the 1980s, but the Aboriginal term is dream track. At the start of is anybody familiar with Aboriginal dreaming stories, yeah? So at the start of the story, the earth itself was still malleable, half awake, if you like. And Kangaroo Dreaming Man, the ancestral progenitor of not only kangaroos, but all kangaroos, frilled lizard man, tortoise woman, little wallaby man, etc. They all wandered the earth singing and shaping the surface as they went, forming plains where they laid down, creeks where they urinated, and forests where they kicked the dust up, etc. So just as with the preparation as plants, you can see that these stories are really clever ways to get people to know where to get food and water when they went on Walkabout. Now this changes, I want you to think about this, it's very subtle, but it changes the way that the Aborigines have got a relationship with the landscape and their language. For Aboriginal people, because of the Dreamtime stories, the encompassing terrain around them is reciprocally mnemonic. They are in a conversation with the land. The language and the land are inseparable. They're like they're experientially coupled in a process of mutual invocation with the land through these stories. And given this radical independence between spoken stories and the sensible landscape, the ethnographic practice of writing down oral stories, I don't know if anybody's ever tried to read a written oral story, they seem weird when they're in published form, because the stories have been torn from the sensuous landscape that give them a place. The features that materially embody and provoke those stories have gone. They're now on a flat, featureless, two-dimensional page. So when you read them, the printed stories seem curious at best and very poorly plotted at worst. Something seems missing, some key that would unlock the abstruse logic of these tales. And that key is the living land itself, the expressive physiognomy of the earth, of the local earth. What's missing is the silent topography of the sensuous hillsides that pose place-specific questions for the stories from which they reply. So when you transpose the alphabet and lay the symbols onto a flat surface, they lose their dreaming power. Once pre-literate individuals from the Aboriginal culture had learnt a lot of these stories, it enabled them to go on Walkabout. They leave the human community and they march off into the desert, and the more stories they've got, the further they can go and the longer they can survive, because they've got stories that are going to tell them where to get food and water and all the rest of it. But the main purpose of going out into the landscape for these guys was to encounter a more than human intelligence within the landscape. When Bruce Chatwin was writing the book for the Dreaming, the Songlines book, he was driving along in a truck with the Aborigines. They were kind of sitting in the back, and they pulled into this track where they were about to go through this valley where you've got hills on one side and so on. And all the Aboriginal guys immediately started singing, and they started singing really fast. And so he's like, well, what are you doing? What are you doing? And then they said, we're singing up the country, boss, which is a lovely phrase. And the reason they were singing fast was because the truck was driving faster than they normally have their tempo. Their tempo is set by their bipedal nature of their footsteps. So the rhythm as they walk through the land. So I was walking, when I went, these two guys over in the corner, we went to visit the crop circle over at Cheryl the other day. And we walked across the hillside. We started, just as we walked up the hill, we started at one point and we started to walk up the hill, and I was explaining this to them. I was saying, this is, my theory. We're walking along the hill, and I was thinking, right, if the song started here, and I start to sing as I walk, and my pace is going, then when I get to the bit about the ancestor that was a hill that urinated over there, when I turn left, I'm going to get water. It physically places me in the land with the stories I've remembered. Can you see? The Aboriginals believe that these walkabouts is where they encounter a mysterious, more than human intelligence that usually teaches us something about life lessons. These walkabouts are like a rite of passage, transformative, conscious-shifting events that deepen the connection of the participant with the landscape and with the human community that they return to. In Native American traditions, we call this a vision quest, handing ourselves over to a more than human intelligence, located somewhere in nature for guidance in our life's journey. In fact, most ancient cultures have some kind of system where you go out and try and face an omnipresent, more than human intelligence to guide you in your life. We're one of the few that don't think about that now, being modern. And when you think about it, crop circles have got thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people who ordinarily wouldn't walk out into fields and cultivated fields and this sort of landscape. It's brought them here on their own mini kind of vision quests. Lots of people come here searching for answers to the crop circles or answers for themselves or both. And when they come out here, they get to experience a kind of mini vision quest in which they start to tell their own stories. They start to make their own memories for stories of things that happen to them, wild coincidences or whatever. Maybe this is because it's no different here than what it is in the Aboriginals. The 6,000-year-old Ridgeway path, I believe, was our old songlines. This is how people pilgrimaged and navigated their way to this area from all over the British Isles. And when we walk through the Ridgeway path, we're Knapp Hill, Milk Hill, Adam's Grave. It's all named. And so I believe that there were creation stories that enabled these people to be able to pass down information so that they could, their language and the landscape would be inseparable, just like the Aborigines walking through here. Visiting crop circles has really brought modern people back into a place where our ancestors lived in reciprocity in a storied relationship with the land. The remnants of this can be found in the bardic tradition that still exists today. So how we used language before we developed an alphabet, we used stories in songs in direct participation and reciprocity with the land, a landscape that was perceived as alive and contained and invisible more than human intelligence. This was normal to these guys. This would have given these people a radically different worldview than one that we can have today. So what happened to our minds when we did actually invent an alphabet and start using symbols? Terence McKenna, whose quotes I love and much of what he says I love, but this one because of this research I've taken issue with. I used to say this quite a lot, that the world is made of words. When we think about it, our experience of the world is that the world is made of words. As he put it succinctly there, the real secret of magic is that the world is made of words, and if you know the words that the world is made of, you can make of it whatever you wish. I'm not into that. Kierkegaard, one of the philosophers, said, if meaning exists just inside us, then we're just the kings of our own castle, right? I can just project whatever meaning I want onto any event, and I can take it all back so that nothing means anything. Meaning has to be a two-way dynamic. We stretch out in the world to find meaning, but the world also has to come back towards us to give us what it actually means. We can't just impose meaning on something from within ourselves. Otherwise, we're just the kings of our own castle. So, alphabet. when you arrange the letters in the correct order, give them the right spelling, you get words. If you don't learn this these days, you're considered illiterate and backward and primitive. Actually, the modern term for literacy has now been upgraded to include computers. So if you don't know how to use computers now, you're a dinosaur. So we think of pre-literate cultures, people that didn't have literature and reading symbols, as being backward and primitive. But I suggest that we need to make some space for that, because there may be some other ways of looking at it. This issue of spelling and putting all the things, there was actually a great article in the Guardian the other day where it says that teachers are getting fed up with the fact that kids are writing great stories, but they can't tell them that they've written great stories because they've got to tell them where they should have put a semicolon and a comma, and it drives the kids mad, so they've given up on their creativity because they're all worried about grammar and punctuation and so on. But spelling was one that plagued us. Whenever we work and put in a big story to our teacher, and they go, oh, you spelt this wrong, you spelt that wrong. Read this. You can't read it? You can. So we didn't need those wrapped knuckles off the teacher, really, did we? You know, we could have got away with that. You know, we could have just said, let's get to the point. You know, the job is done. Okay, it's transmitted the meaning to us, and it didn't matter whether we spelt it right. It gives us a little insight, though, into how automatic and habitual it is to read. As soon as you looked at that, it spoke to you, didn't it? It started to talk to you. So what's going on with our senses, one of Jung's Quarternity, when we read symbols like this? What's really going on here? You can see this little cutie here is engrossed in a wonderful little book. And as she gets engrossed and immersed in the narrative, we don't realise, we take for granted for the fact that we're actually hearing our own voices inside our heads with our eyes. We've rewired our senses since we became literate to use our eyes as hearing now for our own voice inside our head. Whereas the oral culture, the language and the landscape and the reciprocity was all about the sounds that they heard, and their ears were being used for their proper function, and their eyes were being used for their proper function. This actually causes us to be synesthetic. We're rewiring our senses. So like some people report that they can hear colours or see sounds. This is a little video clip.
You can draw sounds. Draw sounds. Yes. I can draw sounds.
So clearly in this film, clearly in this little clip taken from the 13th Warrior of Antonio Banderas, what have I done? He's saying we can draw. Can you draw sounds? It's like this is weird. And Antonio Banderas is seen as the kind of civilized one against the primitive sort of Viking type man in the film. He says, well, of course we can. It's reading and writing. It's simple to him. But to someone that had just encountered it, it's quite new. Take a look at this next clip.
Black Robe, what you do?
Making words.
Words? You not speak.
I will show you. Tell me something.
Tell what?
Something I do not know.
My woman's mother died in snow last winter.
와, 임마마치도.
Wabima, Machi, Ashton.
Hey, Ashton. 기와비마, 블락로.
Last winter, Chimina's wife's mother died in the snow.
Matausio. Matausio.
Ye mamachidu.
I have still other greater things that I can teach you.
I think Matausio would be translated today as, what the fuck? It was a shock. This guy transmitted meaning by scratching some symbols on a page to a guy across the corner, and he couldn't work out how he did it. It's magic to them. And actually, the indigenous people did see it as a form of magic when they first encountered writing. They called it talking leaves. They thought that the leaves talked to you. And isn't it interesting that with that talk of magic and them thinking it was a form of magic, that we've managed to retain the word spell for when we arrange the letters in the correct order? It's quite interesting, isn't it? At the dawn of our civilization, though, it was Pythagoras and Socrates who were teetering on the crossover point of the oral culture, not the Native Americans that we saw in the clip, although I couldn't resist showing you that clip because I think it just encapsulates what I'm trying to get at with how we read symbols, how our mind works when we try to decipher what they mean. What were they saying when Pythagoras and Socrates, what were the Greeks saying when this new technology of writing was being introduced? Let me quickly give you an excerpt from one of Socrates' dialogues regarding the legend of Egyptian king Thamus. Thamus was approached directly by the god Thoth, said to be the divine inventor of geometry, mathematics, astronomy and writing. And he offers as a gift, writing as a gift to the king, so that he may offer it in turn to the Egyptian people. But after consideration, Thamus rejects the offer and says that people will be better off without writing. Against Thoth's claim that writing will make people wiser and improve their memory, the king asserts that the opposite will be the case. If men learn this, it will implant forgetfulness in their souls. They'll cease to exercise memory because they'll rely on that which is written, calling things to remembrance no longer from within themselves, but by means of external marks. Contrast this to the Aboriginal, whose book was the landscape, the stories that he was told by his grandmother. As he actually walked through the landscape, he's recalling the language. Completely different to how we pull off meaning from pages and symbols, abstract symbols. Moreover, the king said that spoken teachings, once written, can easily find their way into the hands of people who will misunderstand them. The written word will not bring wisdom, only the conceit of wisdom, making men seem to know much when in fact they know little. Maybe the real spell that's been cast on us is the one that's got us all to use our eyes to hear our own voices inside our heads, because this leads to another very subtle issue. Just think about this newly found capacity to view and even dialogue with your own words as you write them down, or even in the process of writing them down. It very subtly enables a new sense of autonomy, because you're hearing the most familiar voice of all inside your own head now, which is you. In addition, reading and writing removed reciprocity from of our language with the sensuous surroundings that had been our ancestors' constant interlocutor. This is why I said that writing is a modern form of animism, because reading those written words really does put us firmly inside our heads. It's a newly developed form of animism. It's important to know that writing and reading isn't an evolutionary step that we took. We just invented a new technology and we took it that it was an evolutionary step. But once we started to write things down and consider words in their own right, in their abstract, everything changed at that point. As literates, we can see that the experience of mind is radically different from that of our ancestors walking through the landscape. So this brings me on to this guy, Socrates, and a couple of his proponents as well. Let's just take a quick look at what they were saying at the time. Because this new autonomous awareness that was people were becoming aware of because they were writing stuff down, Plato called our mind the psyche from that. We first of all then started to think about our minds being locked inside our heads. It was a new radical thing. When he took the word psyche from the word psychein, which actually means the wind or to blow or the breath. So the word for psyche before was related to the invisible air, and with Socrates calling it psyche, we started to have a notion that our psyche might be inside our head, So later on, scientists who just say it's biology with neuronal activity had something to go on. So Socrates, if you look back, he didn't write anything down. There are no written dialogues from Socrates. He wasn't illiterate in that sense. He seemed to be the last of the oral culture, and it was his student Plato who wrote a lot. Now, Plato is key to this point I want to make about a transition that how we come to see our psyche and our mind after this transition, after the invention of technology of writing. Plato is considered one of the most important philosophers in history. Sooner or later in crop circle research you encounter his teachings of geometry, philosophy of mind and cosmology. It's mandatory learning really once you start looking at the geometrical symbols. I just want to point this out. Philosophers have always been interested in what is unique about human beings. How is it that human beings engage with and make sense of the world around them? Engaging with objects in the world is really what philosophy is all about. At the heart of Plato's philosophy is his theory of forms or theory of ideas. Which was that we understand things and recognize things and can only use things in the world as long as we have an idea about them. So anything in the world is only as good as what we can think about it. According to Plato, reality consists of two realms. First, there's the physical world of change that we can observe with our five senses. And second, there's a world made of eternal, perfect forms and ideas. What are forms? Plato says that they are perfect templates that exist somewhere above three-dimensional reality. He doesn't tell us where. Maybe they're in the imaginal place that comes from Euler's equation that helps us work air traffic control. But he talks about this imaginal realm. These forms, he says, are the ultimate reference points for all objects that we have in the world. To Plato, these ideas are more real than the physical objects that we see and touch and interact with our senses. He said that you can only find things here on earth in a world of change that are close to perfect. True perfection, according to Plato, only exists elsewhere in an abstract, eternally fixed, unchanging world. The subtle point here is that, in my view, Plato could only begin to think this because he became literate. Unlike his teacher Socrates, Plato was now able to hear his own voice in his head, which then enabled him to sit back and think abstractly about the fixed alphabetic forms he was now considering. In other words, abstract thought detached from reality was only possible because of the alphabet. Reading and writing enabled Plato to radically look at the psyche as the only thing that could connect to this perfect reality that he talked of through pure rational thought. It's like if you look at Descartes' writings later on, Descartes said, "To think, therefore I am." And what he was talking about was that we need to detach from society, we need to detach from people, we need to detach from the body. And if we sit back and just think rationally, all the truths and all the answers will come to us. But if you look at, for example, Martin Heidegger's philosophy in 1927, a German philosopher who wrote Being and Time, he said that Plato had it all wrong. And he started to change the philosophy that had dominated for 2,500 years by saying that we only learn about the world by engaging with objects in the world. So the guitar player, by engaging with the guitar, uses the tool of the guitar to understand more about himself and more about the world. The Japanese word for the name tool, for example, is dogu, which means the way of the carpenter. They're not focused. If you were focusing on the tool, for example, in the Platonic sense, you would say, what colour is it? What shape is it? What materials is it made of? Let's label it into static nuggets of information. But Martin Heidegger would say, if you want to understand the hammer and yourself, pick up the hammer and bang nails in with it. And only through using it, after a while, you use your thinking mind at first when you start banging nails because you don't want to hit yourself on the thumb. but once you've started using it, thinking's the last thing you want to do when you're engaged in operating the hammer. You want to get the whole body engaged and interact with objects in the world. So these two radically different philosophies of looking at it. Plato's abstract. Heidegger's saying, no, the world and its senses is something that we should immerse ourselves in to try and understand the world. And if you look at that, the Aboriginal people and the pre-literate people engage with the world with all of their senses in the right way, and we don't. We sit and read a book, try and find out the knowledge from a magazine. And we don't even know that we're hearing our own voices in our heads when we're doing it. Let me just give you an example of what I mean, just to ram it home. If you consider this word, when you write a word down, it becomes fixed and unchanging, like this perfect reality that Plato's talking about. It's now fixed for us to consider. If we consider this word river, for example, because it's written down, I can now sit back and think about the perfect ideal form of a river. But it's not the one that would be subject to drought or flood, not the one that would have flora or fauna or the tinkling of the river going past if I was standing there. Even this image here is only engaging your eyes. It's not engaging the sensuous you at a river. So I can think of it in its abstract now because of the word that's written above it, river. Makes it fixed and unchanging. So for the first time in human history, because of the written word river, Plato was more easily able to consider it in its abstract form, and later on this was reinforced by Galileo and Descartes, who pushed us more down this abstract, rational thinking is the only way to solve the problems of the universe. And science today says, look, we can't find any answers with our subjective person being involved, it's all got to be objectified. This abstract theory of mind has dominated Western philosophy for the last 2,500 years. It's only Martin Heidegger that come along. And when we look back at ancient Eastern philosophy, their philosophy is that they do it. Our philosophy is that we sit back and think about it and pontificate about it. So the process of learning to read and write with the alphabet, together with the massive influence of Plato, engendered a newly profoundly reflexive sense of the self, one where our minds, our psyche, are abstracted from the world and locked inside our heads. Writing makes it so much easier for the individual internalized and wholly abstract psyche, term derived from wind and breath by Socrates, to be a reality for us. The alphabet changed forever the way we used and even conceived of our minds. Seen in this light, the invention of the alphabet really was a consciousness shift. But it wasn't the first time that we scratched symbols into surfaces. Cave art goes back 40,000 years. And we see, like on this one here, a spiral, and we've also seen this reflected in crop circles. This is a spiral at Wootton Rivers in 2012. Concentric circles is also something that we've seen regularly in crop circles. This one here is at from the Ridgeway in 2013. In fact, a recent survey, really recent actually, in 2011, has shown that 75% of all rock art from various locations, from Australia to Europe, have the same symbols, the circles, squares, spirals. What's clear then is that the human mind has been preoccupied with these basic geometric forms for a very long time. What I find interesting is that a great many of these symbols are based on these basic geometries that we've seen reflected in the crop circle narrative. And this situation persists for sort of 37,000 years, and then we get on to pictograms, and we started to use these as symbols in order to communicate with each other. Now, if you look at these pictures, you'll see that birds, fish, and snakes are very common. This was the first form of writing, but because it's still images taken from the natural landscape, it's sort of like one step away from the animate world. We're kind of still having a reference to the animate world in this form of writing because it's still depicting the characters that live out there that we encounter when we're walking around. So it's not quite abstract alphabet writing yet. But it was our first step in our journey away from the animate landscape and onto the page. And again, we've seen fish and birds represented in the crop circle narrative. Are the crop circles reminding us of this, trying to remind us with this of our this important shift in consciousness, what we did before, how we've evolved? I believe that the crop circles really are like a human history lesson. If you look at it, they're talking about us, talking about what we did, what we do. Then we get to cuneiform. This is not an alphabet, but it's sort of, a lot of people consider it's the first form of writing. It's a lot of evidence that it was used for accounting purposes and bookkeeping. What I've also found interesting is this language was connected to these stones that were recently discovered in southern Turkey. The theories are that these stones were used for accounting purposes in conjunction with cuneiform. That's interesting, isn't it? But I'm pleased to see that they're changing the description away from ritual objects. That's where they discover stuff, archaeologists, and they go, don't know what this is, it's a ritual object. I think the argument for that could be kept open for a little while yet. You know, we could, seeing as we're looking at tetrahedrons and squares and cubes and circles, you know, maybe there was more to it than just being connected to accounting purposes of cuneiform. But research is ongoing with that, so we'll find out. I'm interested to see where it goes. But when we look back in Britain, we find that we have our own enigmatic stones. That these stones were actually made 1,000 years before Plato wrote about these sorts of forms. They're known as the Platonic solids, the square and the cube and the tetrahedron, etc. They were all dug up in the British Isles here. They're all in the Pitt Rivers Museum. I think it's Pitt Rivers up in Oxford. But they were made 1,000 years before Plato wrote about them in Timaeus. Keith Critchlow in Time Stands Still, the book Time Stands Still, says, the mathematical content in terms of sophistication of the concepts exhibited in the forms of the stones can be estimated by studying the laws of division and symmetry, something that we've seen completely laid out in crop circles. Interesting question for me is, were there any stories that were associated with these stones that would give us clues to what perhaps their meaning might have been? Are there animated stories that would have told stories about these stones which would give us some other meaning? We'll never know, I guess. Interestingly, though, Plato's Timaeus was believed to represent the views of the Pythagoreans, who were, according to Aristotle, members of an oral tradition. So this crossover is actually quite interesting for how we're trying to figure out what this is all about. An important point, though, is that cuneiform isn't an alphabet. It just took us up to its birth. The first alphabet was this early form of Hebrew, which again is pictorial. You can see snakes and circles and all that sort of stuff there. The A is actually an ox, look, same that we saw on Göbekli Tepe that was depicted lots of times. If we turn that about 150 degrees, it will become the A that we have in our abstract alphabet now. This is the first alphabet, or Aleph-Beth, again Hebrew. What's interesting about this alphabet is it only contains consonants, no vowels. So the first abstract alphabet, the vowels or the sounded breath had to be added by the person that read the text to make it come alive and to speak, as it were. So these sounds had to be chosen by the reader himself, who would vary the sounded breath according to the context of what he wanted to say. So, like, think about this in English. We have, if I put the alphabetic symbols R and D, then if you were reading it as a Hebrew, you would decide in the context of the language whether or not you would put a long O in, a long I, sorry, for E, sorry, for read, if you're going to say read, or if you're going to put a long I in for ride, or short E for read, or a long O for road. You would actively participate in the reading and decide which vowel sounds you were going to put in, breath sounds. So the interesting thing about this is that to the Hebrew, reading this text, they had to actively participate. Whereas when we read text now, we just do it habitually and automatically. We can't stop ourselves doing it. But this guy had to think about it and wrestle with it before he could recite it. To the Hebrew traditional scholars, reading was, in their view, an active grappling with God's living word. It held the challenges of uncovering secret meanings, unheard of explanations, matters of great weight and significance. It's at this point in our history, though, that a new distance opens between the human culture and the rest of nature. The pictographic writing had already begun to displace us from our sensory participation from the depths of the animate environment onto flat walls or tablets. But the sensible phenomena and its spoken names, in a sense, were still participant with one another. But with the phonetic Aleph-Beth, the written letter no longer refers us to any sensible phenomena that we encounter in the landscape, but solely to a gesture that we make with our mouths. There's a concerted shift of attention away from the outward world of sensible phenomenon that had previously called forth that spoken utterance. We walk through the land and it makes us say something. The Aborigines had to sing as soon as that truck turned into the way. Whereas now, we look at a page and it just speaks to us. It's completely different. 100 years later, that 7th or 8th century, the Greek and also the Hebrew alphabet then fixed the vowel sounds. They fixed the sound of the breath so that no longer did we have to participate and interact in reading. We just did it automatically, and this is when things really started to change for us. A text written with this new fixed vowel sounds contained none of the ambiguity that you would have got from previous texts. That alphabet would allow various possible pronunciations and therefore meanings, but now, with fixing the vowel sounds, only a single correct reading would be allowed. The active participation on the part of the reader has now been largely removed. The interactive synesthetic participation involved in reading, in transforming a series of visible marks into a sequence of sounds, could now become entirely habitual and automatic. The prevalent view amongst linguists today is that language is a set of arbitrary signs, but conventionally agreed upon signs, linked by a formally syntactical system of syntactic rules or grammatical rules. In other words, it's a code, and we just have to agree on it. So if I decide to change this to dog, and we all agree that this is now a dog, then that's language as far as they're concerned. That's it. It's just a code that we've invented. But it's much more than that. We moved away and only allowed ourselves to say this because of the abstract nature of it. You familiar with this? Hebrew word for God, right? A lot of people add in the vowels for themselves, Yahweh, right? So this YHWH, let's think about this for a second. If you think about Y and H, these consonants are actually the closest that you can get to breath sounds or making vowel sounds without actually making them. So just try this for a minute, right? Breathe in and say YH, go, and then go, Yahweh. So they didn't want to say the name of God. They wanted to leave our breath to roll across our tongue to pronounce the word of God. So there was this reverence for the sacredness of the breath by not including the vowel sounds. Do you see? We don't add them ourselves. We just want to breathe in and out, and you're saying God's name to the Hebrew. In the Hebrew Tanakh, the word ruach is what means wind, breath, or mind. They say, in a living creature, the ruach is the breath, whether animal or mankind. God is the creator of ruach. The ruach of God is in my nostrils. In God's hands is the ruach of all mankind. So as we see here, they're creating this reverence for the name of God by just saying that the name of God can't be pronounced. It is the wind. It is the breath. Mind is given to us with the act of breathing. But this apparent precision and efficiency of the new alphabet that contained vowel signs was obtained at a high price, because by using visible characters to represent the breath, the Greek scribes effectively desacralized it for us. By providing a visual representation of that which was by its very nature invisible, they nullified the mysteriousness of the enveloping atmosphere. In one foul swoop, they dissolved the primordial power of the air. Plato's psyche was no longer part of the sensuous world, but rather of another utterly non-sensuous dimension. Our minds had been further constrained by the fixed symbols of the alphabet that now fixed the vowel sounds. We've already seen how the new relation that Plato wrote between the immortal psyche and the transcendental realm of ideas was dependent on the alphabet. But now we can see that the relation between the psyche and Plato's bodiless ideas was also dependent on us gradually forgetting the sacredness of the wind or the air, or what it meant. Excuse me. The Native Americans, when they smoke on the pipe, are we getting close to the end? I'm nearly there. I've got about 5 slides left. The smoke from the sacred pipe revealed the swirls and eddies. So when they sat in a circle and they smoked the peace pipe, they're showing the invisible. They're making the invisible visible with the air. That's why they use the sacred smoke and so on. It reveals this sacred, powerful thing that they thought of to them. My research has shown me that the omnipresent and yet invisible nature of the air actually is the most sacred of all teachings and all traditions. It takes quite a while to find out because they don't want to talk about it. They actually think to give voice to the sacredness of the air and say that it's the most sacred thing violates its mystery. There's one little story I've told before at lectures about Elizabeth Gilbert. She's a famous poet. And when she was asked about her creative process, where she gets the ideas, how do the ideas for her poems come into her mind, she talked about a story where she used to be out in the fields picking cotton. And she said that she heard the poems come across the landscape like a gust of wind. And as soon as she heard them, she used to run to her little hut to get a pencil and a paper and write them down, because she knew that the inspiration of the idea was coming at her across the landscape, thundering, she said, towards her. Sounds a bit strange. Famous poet though, right? And when you talk about people's creative processes, you know, you can get some weird stories. But that's how her creative process worked. She felt that the wind came across and inspired her. She would run to her little hut and write down, and if she got there in time, she would write down what came through her. She said sometimes she didn't actually get to the hut in time, and she'd feel this gust of wind go through her, and she said it would go off looking for another poet. Once, she said, that she sat down, and she just got there just as the poem went through her, and she grabbed it and pulled it back and wrote the poem backwards. Interesting, huh? Maybe this is where we get the phrase, the breath of inspiration. Ideas can just come to us with I've got it. Our mind has changed. We had a consciousness shift with the breath. The aha moment, exactly. Maybe this is where the muse comes from. I'll come on to this point in a moment. But just take a look at this footage from inside a fresh formation. Oh my God, the way that opens out down there. Barley swirl. Jung gave us the quaternity that I mentioned earlier, these four aspects of our mind: thinking, feeling, sensing and intuition. But he also gave us this issue of archetypes. When we think of the muse, when we think of the breath of inspiration, we know that stories in the past have anthropomorphized this unknown other into a character that we can then characterize as the thing that gives us inspiration. Stephen King, the writer, says that his muse is a big fat bloke that lays on his sofa smoking cigars, and that he's pumming away on his typewriter, and every now and again this guy grunts and gives him an idea that he knew he couldn't have ever come up with himself. But if you speak to most writers, they all say they've got a muse, or musicians or artists. Where is this thing that brings with us the aha moment, as Karen says? There are a lot of researchers that claim that Shiva, the archetype of Shiva, originally came from a psychedelic mushroom because of the blue colour. When you pinch a psychedelic mushroom, it bruises and takes on this colour. Shiva is seen as the destroyer of negativity, the remover of the negativity, so that growth and renewal can come through, presumably in our psyche. So the archetype of Shiva is pretty similar to what can happen to people who take psychedelic mushrooms. Psychedelic, right? They go look at Haight-Ashbury. People went to Haight-Ashbury. They all done LSD and mushrooms, and they all said to the government, "You know what? We're not going to go to Vietnam. We're going to go for love and peace." It changed their consciousness. We're talking about a consciousness shifting thing, which is invisible. We represent it with a plant and then characterize it into a story like Shiva, but really we're talking about some invisible thing which can change our consciousness. People talking about these substances often experience what Socrates called divine madness or divine inspiration. Their views of the world change, just like the people who went to Haight-Ashbury and said we're not going to the Vietnam War. Okay. But for me, by far, number is the biggest form of archetype. Louise von Franz, she said that number, as it were, lies behind the psychic realm as a dynamic ordering principle, the primary element of which Jung called spirit. As an archetype, number becomes not only a psychic factor, but more generally a world structuring factor. In other words, numbers point to a background reality in which psyche and matter are no longer distinguishable. So number, when we boil it all the way down, we can talk about archetypes and stories that we've created in our mind and our language that's different from the words that we put on a page because we didn't have an alphabet. But when we boil all of that down, this 5, 8 and 13 that exists in my teeth and the 5, 8 and 13 that's out there in the plants, right behind matter and psyche is number. She said, this lady, that some mathematicians claim that they invented number, that human beings came up with it. But when they did, they found that they had all sorts of properties like quadratics and integers and so on, and pi. So numbers actually then, we found, were already here. So the human mind says, oh, we discovered number, but when we discovered it, it's already here. And then we find it's already woven into the fabric of the world with Venus and so on. And it's a constituent part of the crop circle narrative. Geometry is number in space. A square is 4, a triangle is 3, and so on. Furthermore, she points out that the arithmetic of the I Ching, those zeros and ones that we saw in Euler's equation formation, that we had to translate into Euler's equation, are the same as the genetic code. How did that come to be? We use it for computer language now, but they seem to have been there all the time. This suggests that the idea of numbers already existed in some form, a form which Jung called an archetype. Number then is the most primal form of archetype, and its relation to the world and the human psyche is what I believe the crop circles have made very clear throughout their campaign. For me, this joins together all the concepts I've been discussing today and confirms that the meaning behind the narrative of the crop circles has to be directing us towards this topic of mind. What is our self-aware mind? What do we understand about it? How can we know more about it by understanding what the alphabet does to us? So what good does any of this do us for helping possible consciousness shift to bring about the more positive future? The crop circles, ratios and proportions have taught us that a great deal about these geometric relationships that I said earlier, and that we can apply it. They implicitly teach us about harmonious and non-harmonious relationships through the geometry of this number. But when we extrapolate these issues to our own lives, we see that it's our relationship to mind because of literature and our relationship to the land with agriculture that's the issue. And the modern detached world that emerged from this has in turn seriously impacted the relationships that we all now have with each other. Before the alphabet, I believe the oral cultures existed in what we can call a golden relationship. It's clear to me that they built these stone circles and stone monuments with a massive effort of cooperation. There wasn't some guy on a horse with a whip telling them to build them. If you go to Sligo in southwest Ireland, there's 5,125 stone circles alone. These people have nothing else to do. It would have taken more than the population of the British Isles years and years and years and years and years to keep building all these things. And because of that mystery, we jumped to the alien solution, but I prefer to keep it down on Earth and say, maybe we had something else going on. But this golden relationship, golden meaning you could say, they understood the world was mysteriously woven from number because they encoded it into these stone circles and monuments in Wiltshire. They revered the spirit wind as a mysterious, more than human intelligence that they encountered on their walkabouts or vision quests. Their language was intimately tied in reciprocity with the animated landscape. I'm pretty sure if the crop circles could scream, it would be that word, reciprocity, which I've used quite deliberately a lot through in this presentation. If I had to choose that word, one word, it would sum it up. Keith Critchlow, again, he wrote a paper 2 years ago for the Kairos Foundation entitled, What is Golden Meaning? So all of what I've said before, if it doesn't relate back to us and how we can change ourselves, then to be honest, it doesn't mean anything. I want to find a way that we can think about how we can do something about it. So this is what Keith Critchlow says. Sameness holds the dangers of uniformity. Difference holds the dangers of disintegration. And being holds them in balance. Differences are evident and automatically divide people. However, as we all have our humanity in common, in that there is profound sameness. What then is the mysterious basis of meaning or essence? It is essentially a mean between excessive sameness and excessive difference. And it's our job to try and not be too uniformed and not be too different from everybody else that we're in chaos. There is no civilization that does not speak of harmony and balance as the middle way. Think about this. What is a conversation between two people? A sharing of experiences, ideas, beliefs, all manner of things. Yet between those two people lies a third invisible factor, what we call their relationship. Now this may be very temporary and short-lasting if one person insists, even possibly aggressively, on their view being right regardless of the other person's views or intentions or beliefs or ideas. On the other hand, the relationship most likely to become deeper if there's a respectful exchange of views and ideas or intentions. The golden mean in geometry, therefore, is a pentagram produces a harmonious relationship, but with us, what we're looking for in our human relationships is to strive to find a more balanced and harmonious way to coexist peacefully with other people who have different views. That's what we're all kind of struggling from now. Last slide. I've made a pretty strong case to show that the alphabet's done us no good whatsoever and that it's tricked our minds and we've all been under some kind of spell, right? And some of that's true. But without the alphabet, the written word through printed media wouldn't have spread around the world and we wouldn't be able to recognize the equality and sameness that we all share together as human beings. But at the very moment we've come to recognize this, we discover that so many other species are rapidly dwindling and vanishing, that the rivers are choking from industrial wastes and that the sky itself is wounded. At the very moment that the idea of human equality has finally spread into every nation, it becomes apparent that it is indeed nothing more than an idea. That in some of the most developed nations, humans are nevertheless destroying each other physically and emotionally in unprecedented numbers, whether through warfare, callousness, or corporate greed, or through some other rapidly spreading indifference. Clearly something is terribly missing. Some essential ingredient is neglected or simply forgotten in our rush towards a common world. In order to obtain the astonishing, the unifying image of the whole earth whirling in the darkness of space, humans, it would seem, have had to relinquish something just as valuable, the humility and grace that comes from being fully part of the world. We have forgotten the poise that comes from living in a storied relation and a reciprocity with the myriad things that we share this world with. If we could only renew that reciprocity, only by grounding our newfounded capacity for literate abstraction in those oral forms of experience, will the abstract intellect find its real value. It's not a matter of going back, it's coming full circle, uniting our capacity for core reason with those more sensorial and mimetic ways of knowing, letting the vision of a common world root itself in our direct participatory experience with the local and particular. But if, however, we persist in our reflective cocoon, then all our abstract ideals and aspirations for a unitary world will prove horribly delusory. If we do not soon remember ourselves to our sensuous surroundings, if we do not reclaim our solidarity with the other sensibilities that inhabit and constitute those surroundings, then the cost of our human commonality may be our common extinction. It's clear to me that the authors of the crop circles have not used the alphabet for very clever reasons. The form and the context that they take is the most ingenious way to enable us to discover what the message is about and what the narrative is about through our own participation. My 20 years of bouncing around these things has shown me that there's a whole lot of meaning to the crop circles, and I believe that they're written in a language older than words. Thank you very much.